Every prison ever built was designed around a single assumption: that steel, concrete, water, and time can successfully contain the human will. History has proven, repeatedly and brutally, that this assumption is flawed. But the real stories behind the most audacious prison breaks aren't about freedom. They are about obsession. They are deep dives into minds pushed to the absolute edge of what a human being can tolerate, and exactly what those minds turn into once they get to the other side. You are watching Retribution Wire. Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on 3 specific cases where the walls came down. We are bypassing the standard headlines to examine the raw, hidden psychological files of Alcatraz, the classified archives of the East German Stasi, and a terrifying physical riddle left behind in the Australian Outback. In every single one of these files, the question isn't just how they got out, it's what they became in order to do it. Alcatraz sits on a 12-acre rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay. The water surrounding it stays between 50 and 60 degrees year-round, churning with unpredictable, violent currents. The nearest shore is over a mile of open, freezing water. For 29 years, the Federal Bureau of Prisons called it completely escape-proof. And they were right. Until the night of June 11th, 1962. That night, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin vanished from their cells. They were never recaptured. Their bodies were never found. And the world has spent over 60 years debating whether they survived the swim. But what most documentaries completely skip over is what these 3 men did to themselves, psychologically and methodically, during the 14 months leading up to their disappearance. Frank Morris arrived at Alcatraz in January 1960. He had an IQ of 133 and had been escaping from reformatories and prisons since he was 13 years old. Morris didn't just break out of places. He studied his past failures the way an engineer studies a collapsed building to figure out the exact point of structural weakness. When he got to Alcatraz, he didn't start planning right away. He just observed. He spent his first 6 months tracking the guard rotations, the maintenance schedules, the ceiling structures, and the exact minutes when the cell house operated at minimum staffing. He kept all of this cataloged in his head because writing anything down was a death sentence for the plan. By the time the Anglin brothers arrived in 1961, Morris had found his entry point. Every cell had a narrow utility corridor running behind it, accessed through a small ventilation grate. The bolts were steel, but the surrounding concrete had a fatal flaw. It was poured in 1934 using a saltwater mixture that had been quietly degrading from the inside out for nearly 3 decades. To the untrained eye, it looked solid. To Morris, who spent months learning the texture of his cell, it was soft. The digging started in the spring of 1961, using discarded spoons and a crude drill made from a stolen vacuum motor. They had a tiny 35-minute window of silence every night between guard rounds. Month after month, the work continued. The Anglins dug out their own cells in parallel, communicating with Morris through a complex tap code. They hid the expanding holes with false wall panels made of cardboard, soap, and paint. But the physical work was only half the battle. The prison psychiatrist's notes from that year reveal an unsettling shift in Morris's behavior. He had become unnaturally still. The notes describe him as present in a way that left absolutely no room for normal human interaction. The Anglin brothers were changing too. John started experiencing severe, unspoken, intrusive thoughts, and Clarence stopped sleeping more than 3 hours a night. They cut off all social contact with other inmates, not out of anger, but to conserve every ounce of mental energy for the wall. They were systematically stripping away their own humanity to become tools for the escape. On June 11th, the holes were wide enough. Morris crawled through the utility corridor first, scaling the ventilation shaft to the roof before descending the exterior walls to the shore. He had spent over a year constructing a raft out of 50 stolen raincoats, complete with homemade wooden paddles. The Anglin brothers were right behind him. The night was freezing, and a thick fog completely swallowed the bay. They stepped into the water and were never seen again. The FBI hunted them for 17 years before closing the case in 1979. The official conclusion was that they drowned, but that was based purely on a lack of sightings, not the recovery of physical evidence. Then, in 2013, the US Marshals received a letter allegedly signed by John Anglin, claiming all three survived and were living under assumed names in poor health. The government has never verified it. The case remains open. 3 days before the breakout, the prison psychiatrist wrote one final cryptic note on Frank Morris. It read simply, "Patient appears to have resolved something fundamental. I cannot determine what." Whatever happened out in the freezing dark of the bay, the men who entered the water weren't the same inmates who had arrived on the island. They had already been entirely remade by 14 months of silent, consuming purpose, marking the end of a file where physical reality was chipped away by sheer obsession. But while Frank Morris dismantled a concrete wall to escape an island, our next file involves an inmate who had to dismantle his own mind. To understand how far psychological isolation can push a person, we have to travel to a Cold War facility that officially didn't even exist. During the height of the Soviet era, the East German Stasi ran detention facilities so deeply classified they were left off every public map. People living a block away had no idea what was inside. There were no postal deliveries and no official addresses. If you were taken there, you simply ceased to exist to the outside world. These compounds were built for one specific purpose: the systematic psychological destruction of political dissidents. They didn't use physical torture. They used something far more precise and terrifying. It was a psychological protocol called Zersetzung, or decomposition. The goal was to make a prisoner completely doubt their own perception of reality. Guards would enter cells in secret and move objects by a few centimeters. Strange, untraceable noises would echo through the vents. Interrogators would drop casual hints that the prisoner's family outside was being targeted. It was a constant, low-level assault on the mind until the victim's grip on reality completely collapsed. In 1972, a 34-year-old schoolteacher named Heinrich was brought to the HOHENSCHÖNHAUSEN facility. He had been intercepted trying to mail a critical letter to West Germany. He had zero military background and no survival training. He was the exact type of soft target Zersetzung was engineered to break. But the Stasi made a massive tactical error. They didn't realize what happens when you teach a highly analytical mind to question absolutely everything. For Zersetzung to work, the prisoner has to believe in a stable, normal reality so they can notice the small changes. The chair was here. Now it's there. But after 3 months of manipulation, Heinrich reached a terrifyingly logical conclusion. He decided that there was no stable reality left. He accepted that everything around him, the walls, the guards, the food, the threats, was completely manufactured. Once he accepted that nothing could be verified, the Stasi lost all their leverage. Heinrich completely stopped reacting to the moved objects or the psychological traps. His interrogators logged their growing confusion, noting that the psychological warfare was producing zero measurable anxiety. Heinrich wasn't breaking down. He was detaching himself from the environment entirely, realizing his inner reactions were the only thing he still controlled. On a Thursday morning in October 1972, he executed his move. For 8 months, Heinrich had carefully studied the behavior of other inmates who actually had lost their minds. He systematically built a fake clinical profile, mimicking the exact verbal delays, physical tics, and sudden outbursts of a total psychiatric collapse. He played the part so perfectly that the prison physician panicked, bypassed standard protocol, and ordered his immediate transfer to a civilian psychiatric hospital 3 miles away. It was the only route out of the facility that contained a gap in the Stasi security escort. He was loaded into a civilian medical van with only one guard. 4 minutes into the drive, while the van was stopped at a chaotic traffic intersection, Heinrich simply opened the door and walked out into the crowd. He crossed the border into West Germany 11 days later. When West German intelligence debriefed him, an officer asked how he managed to survive 8 months of psychological decomposition without losing his mind. Heinrich looked at him and said, "I didn't avoid the breakdown. I just went to a place inside my mind where they couldn't follow. The breakdown they were trying to force on me looked identical to the state I put myself in. The only difference was that I chose mine." The intelligence officer noted in the file that it was the most chilling response he had recorded in 20 years of counterintelligence work. Heinrich went back to teaching in West Germany and lived a completely quiet life until his retirement. He never gave an interview, and he never wrote a book. The single document in the German Federal Archive remains the only evidence of how he did to survive the prison that wasn't there, weaponizing his own mind to permanently close his file. But while Heinrich's story left behind a psychological secret, the final file in tonight's breakdown is perhaps the most disturbing of all, because it leaves behind a physical riddle that investigators still refuse to talk about publicly. We turn our attention now to the desolate Australian outback. The Murchison Remand Center was an isolated maximum security facility dropped directly into the Western Australian outback, surrounded by hundreds of miles of flat, desolate scrubland. In 1983, a man serving a life sentence for murder, identified in the files only as Thomas R.R. due to a strict, permanent government suppression order, completely vanished from a locked isolation cell. The cell had a single solid steel door, secured from the outside with a heavy deadbolt and a reinforced iron bar. 2 guards conducted the final night check, witnessed the prisoner inside, locked the door, and signed the official logbook. The door was never opened until the morning shift arrived. When they turned the key, the cell was empty. Thomas R. was gone. The inmate had been at Murchison for 6 years. Guards described him as someone who had simply stopped being present. He wasn't violent or depressed. He was just a shell. It was as if the human element had exited his body, leaving a functional physical exterior behind to follow orders. 3 days before he vanished, Thomas R. had been tossed into isolation following a severe, unexplained altercation with 3 other inmates. Immediately after the fight, those 3 inmates were quietly transferred to separate facilities across the country, and their central files were permanently sealed. The isolation cell was a concrete box measuring 9 feet by 7 feet. There were no windows. The ceiling and floor were reinforced concrete. The only ventilation was a tiny wall grate measuring 8 inches by 4 inches. Far too small for a human arm, let alone a body, to pass through. When the police launched their investigation, they ruled out guard complicity after both night shift officers passed multiple polygraph tests. The mechanical locks were dismantled and tested 47 times. They were flawless. But then, the detectives noticed something that defied all logic. Because the facility sat in the middle of the outback, a fine layer of red desert dust naturally settled over the concrete floors within hours of any cleaning. The dust in Thomas R.'s cell was completely undisturbed. The deep tracks where he had been sitting in the far corner, facing the wall, were clearly visible. But there were absolutely no footprints leading from that corner to the steel door. The red dust across the floor was pristine. It was as if whatever left the cell had never actually touched the ground to do so. The lead detective appended a raw, handwritten note to the formal report that read, "I am not prepared to suggest what the dust pattern implies. I am prepared to say that no conventional explanation accounts for it. A secondary joint government task force was brought in, but their findings remain classified under national security protocols. The heavily redacted pages that have cleared Freedom of Information requests show they tracked down the 3 inmates from the original fight. All 3 refused to speak on tape, stating they had been warned of severe consequences. When the task force pushed them to reveal who gave the warning, the names were completely blacked out by government censors. Thomas R. has never been found. 42 years later, his profile remains active on the active escapee database, protected by an ironclad anonymity order. The government has never explained why a missing, low-level inmate from 1983 requires a level of classification, usually reserved for military secrets. 3 separate files, 3 cases where the walls simply failed. The first required a man to completely dismantle his own mind over 14 months to find a physical blind spot. The second required a teacher to retreat into a psychological blackout to beat his captors at their own game. And the third left behind a physical impossibility that the government is still hiding behind redacted files. Every prison ever built assumes that the entity trapped inside the concrete can be held. The data from tonight's cases suggest that sometimes the walls are entirely useless against what's really lurking inside the cell. The links to our full case community are in the description below. No names are ever required to share a file. New documentaries drop every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Subscribe to Retribution Wire, keep your eyes open, and I will see you in the next file.